Okay. And let's see. Okay. All right. So yeah, the title of my talk was kind of centered on this idea of a lot has changed since the last time I was giving a talk here, and things have maybe gotten a little bit uh, well less positive in their outlook. Let's say if you're concerned about the environment. So I've been on this kick lately to try and be more positive and think forward and keep moving the needle as best I can, regardless of what's going on at the national level. So this is my little outline of kind of what I've done and been doing since the last time we talked, and a reminder to myself more than anything to continue to think about our our planet as a whole and do what I can where I can. So, and if anybody has any questions during the talk, please feel free to interrupt me. It's no big deal. I'm very laid back about that. So, okay. Here we go. So, when I was growing up, um, we had a lot of educational opportunities for kids to learn about the environment and learn about what Earth Day was. And this is a picture of me from the late 1980s down here in the bottom center portion, wearing the red jacket. And we were at Environmental Need Camp where we got to learn all about banana slugs and go on nature hikes and especially learn a little bit more about what our world had to offer us in the outdoors. And it was a really pivotal time for me in my life, especially because, as kids, we were learning about things like the ozone hole, which was a really big problem for our planet. And what we saw during that time was a coalition of countries really come together, listen to their scientists, talk about what was going on, do some studies, and come up with a plan to solve this problem. And we completely reversed that very detrimental issue of the loss of our ozone layer, which is a very protective component of our Earth's atmosphere, keeping solar radiation away from our bodies. So, yeah, I kind of grew up with the idea that you could do stuff. People could come together, smart people who cared, and they could solve problems. And I really think we can still do the same thing today. And that's what I'm really hoping to do myself, especially as it concerns, air quality, not just locally, but regionally, nationally, and certainly I would hope that we could work together as a planet because we all share the same air. Um, and I've had the privilege, I would say, of living lots of places in my life where air quality wasn't so great. So when I moved here to Northwest Indiana, you'll probably be familiar in the top left here, the photo of Gary Works. And I had recently come from Alaska, which is sort of diagonally down here in the bottom right, where we had terrible inversions in the winter, and our power plant exhaust would just fall right back on top of us in town. If we look in the top right, I was previously in Salt Lake City, which was also a place where some really bad inversions would occur because of the natural geography between the mountain ranges. And then my younger life, I grew up in California. And the bottom left here, we see lovely Los Angeles before California started to enact some of the most stringent air quality policies in the country. And because of the number of cars that are in California, they really changed how our nation thinks about vehicle emissions. And I would hope that those lessons are still in the forefront of some people's minds because, again, it was a problem that they learned about, they addressed, and things are a lot better in California now. So, what I have started goofing around with recently, and you probably might recall this from my last talk, are these little air sensors. They're sort of part of they called it the Internet of Things, right? So they're these little devices that can connect to the internet and sort of communicate their data, their information, temperature, humidity, all sorts of little Wi-Fi gadgets you can get in your microwave now or your home thermostat, and everything's sort of connecting itself. And so these little devices are part of that movement, or better or worse. And what you can kind of see here in the blue bottom of this sensor is the particle detector, and you've got a couple fans that are drawing air inside of those two blue sensors. Each little purple air monitor has two devices that are measuring the air quality so that they can validate each other. And as that air mass is sort of sucked into the instrument, there's a little laser pointer in there, and that laser pointer sort of bounces light off of all the little particles, and that light is then detected, and based on the amount of scattered light, that's correlated to how many particles are in the air. And so these are really good little devices at counting particles of a particular size. They're sort of better at small particles than big particles. And that's kind of interesting for human beings because those really small particles are the ones that can really get into our deep lung and sort of get stuck there. And they run these little sensors, take a data point sort of every 2 minutes while they're running, every hour of every day, of every week, of every year that they're sort of out there. And one of the interesting things I'm starting to learn is that I am going to have to become much better at managing my data because I have so many numbers now that I've got to be really organized about keeping track of them. But caring about air quality like I did, we were able to get some funding to buy some of these sensors and start to place them out in the community, especially at a time when Indiana and our state policymakers were deciding to remove some of the air quality sensors that we have in Northwest Indiana and elsewhere around the state. I won't get into the reasons behind that. Not sure I totally understand why. I mean, I sort of have an idea, but I thought that was a really great idea so that our citizens could have better information about what their air quality was, anytime they wanted to go to the Purple Air website, basically. And this is what the Purple Air website looks like. I probably showed you guys this last time, but you can see in this map here down along the bottom, lots of these little red dots with numbers over 100 typically. And that's indicating that we've got some pretty bad air quality. And that's why they're kind of this bright red color. Red is bad and green is good. And so the idea being we want to see all of these sensors have nice green colors to them and nice small numbers, meaning that we have good air quality. And on the Purple Air map, you can kind of see a chart that will pop up if you click on any one of those sensors. And it shows you the past few weeks or months, depending on what you ask it for, of the air quality in that region, or from that sensor itself. And you can even compare two sensors to each other in this little plot. Really handy little tool. You can access it with your cell phone. I think they even have a little widget you can download now to have on your home screen. But yeah, it's essentially live time telling our citizens whether or not they should be concerned about their air quality.
I want to go to Verizon in Maryville.
Now?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't need to listen to that. That sounds like you go.
You can listen to it if you want.
Yeah, we can go.
Huh?
We can go.
would everybody,
There's only 10 minutes.
would, ev- would everybody mute so we can hear the speaker? Thank you. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, cool. No worries. I thought somebody had a question, so I wanted to make sure to listen in.
Okay.
So, yeah. Okay, so we've got lots of these little purple air sensors out there, and more of them have continued to pop up just about every month. I look on here, I see more people getting involved with the Purple Air project. I love this. It's great. I think it's really a nice tool for people to have. So yeah, big fan. This is a plot which you might recall from a couple summers ago when we had some really bad forest fire smoke. And you'll see here, I don't have the green and yellow and red colors on this plot. But here I've kind of put this dashed green line indicating, below this is pretty decent air quality. But if you start getting above this dashed green line, you're getting into some not great air quality. And we see a couple of very sustained peaks for lasting, multiple days even above that green line. And those were days where we had forest fire smoke coming down from Canada and, sort of really clouding up our air here in Northwest Indiana, as well as lots of other places in the United States. So for me, this was one of the first really big tests that we did with our sensors where we could say we have an event, we can see that the air quality is bad, we can smell that the air quality is bad. It's showing up on our sensors. They're all agreeing with each other. So this is really good validation for me that our sensors were working pretty well. And just to show you some of what that looked like here in the top left, you can see nationwide, all the purple air sensors kind of gathered together. And I love seeing this map because I love looking at it and saying, so many people are caring about their air quality. And I think that's great. And you can see the big purple region up in Canada, and then almost like a highway, the smoke is drifted down into the Great Lakes regions and then even into the southern part, southeastern part of the United States. And on different days, you could see that some of those purple, really high zones of bad air quality made their way into New York and Massachusetts. And those were days where we were seeing news reports about this in the morning. It was a really uh, bad situation. And in the top right, you can see some of those fires in Canada that my student took a picture of. And their smoke was, getting wafted up and basically dumped back down somewhere on the other side of the border. But that was a very useful test for us. And we got another test not too long ago wherein BP lost power. And they actually had to start burning off their product at the refinery. And this was a picture that was taken by one of the news agencies, sort of showing that continuous burn that they had to undergo. And our sensors were actually able to pick that up. And there were some folks talking about it on some of the newspaper forums and stuff around Northwest Indiana. And yeah, they showed that they work really well for letting people know when they should not be outside when that sort of thing is happening. So that was a really nice, well, it was not nice, but it was a very useful time for the air sensors, I felt. So one of the things I kind of want to dive into tonight and get in a little bit to the nitty gritty on is talking about the numbers that these little sensors, which are relatively cheap, less than $300 for one of these sensors. Some of my sensors that I use in the lab are over $10,000. And so I think as far as, a nice little tool, they're decently affordable. And, we've been able to use some of the money from our grants to buy these sensors and get them out to community members and schools. But there's been some debate about whether or not they are doing as good of a job at measuring air quality as one of our, sort of standard air quality sensors that would be used by the EPA or some other federal agency to measure air quality. So we decided to test our purple air sensor, and we sort of borrowed an EPA sensor that they give out to their community members for their own measurements. And by borrowed, I mean I bought one off of eBay with my grant proposal money, the exact same kind that the EPA hands out. And I said, let's do a test. And my students and I got together last summer and ran them scientifically from the same air mass, the same pipe, to see how their measurements stacked up. And so that sensor is right here in light blue. This is a thermoscientific sensor, probably I don't know, three, four, $5,000 sensor. A little bit higher quality light sensor and light scattering air column inside, slightly better pump and a little bit higher resolution. Uh, in sort of the navy blue on the top right is a over $10,000 air sensor that uses light scattering of multiple different types of lasers. So that's, pretty advanced. Then we've got the very humble and meager purple air sensor down here in the bottom left. And then at the same time, and this was a 4 sensor test, I ran one of my very expensive. And so these things would cost, I don't know, 20 or $30,000 back when they were first made. Cascade impactors. And so cascade impactors don't use laser beams to detect scattered light and particles. They actually just suck the particles in and they stick onto a piece of tape. And then I look at that piece of tape and I can see the deposition lines from times when air quality was really bad, or it'll be kind of a blank spot where air quality wasn't that bad and there weren't a whole lot of particles in the air. And it has 3 separate chambers, which aren't really important other than they collect different sizes of particles. And ultimately, we can do some chemistry to sort of figure out what particles were actually present. So we did all 4 of these air sensors for the same 6-week test. And that's what's sort of shown here. It's hard to see, but there's just a stack of sensors down here in the bottom right that I'm taking a picture of, and a couple of them are underneath these shelves. And I don't know why I decided to take a picture of my feet and not the sensors better, but anyway, we had them all running at the same time. And we got some really interesting results. And so all 4 sensors are plotted here. And in sort of the bottom part of the graph, you'll notice there's kind of a light blue line and a dark purple line. And I decided to give the purple color to our purple air sensor. And that light blue line is from the EPA thermoscientific sensor that they give out to communities. And you might notice that it's kind of hard to see those plots because they're almost right on top of each other. And that's actually really good news for us because what it tells us is that our little, under $300 purple air sensor is measuring air particulates just as accurately as the $3, $4, $5,000 sensor that EPA buys to hand out to their communities when they need to do a quick air test. And so I thought that was just great news. So moving up in the plot, though, you'll notice I kind of have this banded center image where we see these lines, and this is the tape from my cascade impactor. And so it's really interesting to sort of look at where some of those dark lines show up and think about some of the peaks of air quality that we see in the graphs. And so really interesting, like we could look sort of in this center region here, and we see that there's kind of 3 dark lines in a row, and we've kind of got 3 peaks here right in a row where we see air quality is not that great. And those peaks show up down here with the purple air and the thermosensor as well. The one thing I was very disappointed about, though, is at the very top of this plot in sort of the navy blue is my most expensive, most modern, most fancy sensor with multiple lasers and all kinds of whiz-bang things. And although it very much agreed with sort of the peak pattern that we see, um, it said that the air quality was actually a lot worse than either the purple air or the thermoscientific sensor. And my suspicions are at this point that there was maybe some background where the sensor had gotten dirty and it was just measuring too high. I can subtract that out and bring those peaks down, and they actually match up really well with the purple air and the thermoscientific sensor. But unfortunately, I only got sort of 3 out of 4 in terms of being able to measure all four instruments at once. Another really fascinating thing that I'll point out to you is that every time we sort of see a dark band on this center cascade impactor tape, or we don't see a dark band, it's not always consistent with where we see a peak or a trough in the data. And that's really interesting. And part of the reason for that, that I'll explain now, is that this tape was only from the largest size particles that came through that sensor. And it has 2 other tapes that collect smaller particle sizes all the way down to, I think, 0.1 microns or something very, very small that would go into our lungs and it's never coming out. Well, because there's a distribution of those particle sizes and we're not really separating them so well with the other light scattering detectors, we may not always see coincident bands where we would expect them from that tape and in the spectra. So that is a really sort of interesting artifact of that. The other thing I'll mention is that um, when I'm wrapping this tape around one of these cylinders where it's going to be collecting all these different size particles, sometimes that tape can stretch a little bit. And so it's a little bit interesting trying to line it up exactly with where it should be with all of these different peaks that are coming out of the data from the light scattering detectors. So yeah, but otherwise, I thought this was really great to see that our detector, our purple air sensor, seems to be performing on the level of many $1,000 more expensive sensors, which is great. Now, that being the case, we still have some issues, and I'll get into that next, which is what if we try to take our purple air sensors and compare them to the data that EPA publishes on their website for their sensors, which are not like our sensors and are the actual sensors that they use to enforce policy for attainment zones and other things like that, especially when these sensors are located in Northwest Indiana. And that's how they get information about how the industries in our region are performing in terms of their releases and their air quality. So this is a little bit of a hot topic. Um, I'm not all the way there on completely making my point about this, but I I'm getting close. So we'll just go ahead and see what happens. So here we go. All right. So on this slide, on the right side, I've got my purple air sensor. And this is back from, I guess it would be August of 2022. Um, and you can see that I have lots of peaks and lots of troughs in my data. Sometimes it gets up into the yellows, sometimes it gets up into the red. Um, this data is very fine resolution. Remember, these sensors take a data point every 2 minutes. So we've got lots of data points. And when I take the entire year of those data points and sort of smush them all together in a plot up above where we see this distribution of days where particles were mostly not present and we had good air quality. But then you can see we've got some of these bars reaching into the yellow and then into the orange and even a few into the red here. where the air quality was getting bad. And we can kind of measure based on the number of data points that we have in those zones, how many days people were exposed to air quality of that level. So for the most part, we see a lot of, the green data here, where most of our days were somewhere between 0 and 50 micrograms per cubic meter. That's sort of the healthy range. But we do see quite a few days in the yellow, quite a few in the orange, and then even some out here in the red. And, we're at each of those data points. If we're looking back here into the orange, we're talking like an entire day where over that year, there was a whole day summed together where the air quality was above 100 micrograms per cubic meter. That's not great. Okay. So we might say to our federal agencies, hey, why is my air quality so bad? My purple air sensor is telling me I'm not breathing in some good stuff. Well, let's move over to the left side of this slide, because on the left side of this slide is the data that is published by the EPA, and they get this from some of their Indiana Department of Environmental Management sensors, IDEM data. There's two things I want to point out. The first one should be pretty obvious, and that's that all of the days that the EPA measures are in the green zone. Like all not just in the green zone, but strongly in the green zone, not even close to coming to the yellow zone. And if we look at their measurements for the month of August in 2022, we see some very low values. And additionally, we don't have very good resolution because there's just sort of these big jaggedy points where they took a data point every third day. So not only are they not measuring every day, it's every third day. And the sum aggregate of their measurement on that day is so low that you have to ask yourself, why is that? Why is this data so different than what's coming out of my purple air sensor? And my students and I were really flummoxed by this. Susan Duncan, who's also been present in this group a number of times, has faced the same problem with some of her purple air sensors. So we're going to hopefully talk about why that might be. But I see we have a question. So
Yes. Hi, Dr. Iceman. This is Pat Walter. I've been
Pat,
very, hi, nice to see you, or meet you. I am curious about when you said the item sensors, because I'm familiar with the federal EPA, and of course, BP recently put up or last year, they put up what they're calling fence line.
yep.
And as you know, fence line is, I mean, how can I say this kindly, but I can't. They're useless. Because they average stuff over 2 weeks, which is getting us nowhere. But I'm not sure
Right.
what you're talking about. Where are the item? Are these the federal EPA?
So that's a great question. And there's it's sort of hard to decipher who owns which sensor. So there's times when it's been listed as an IDEM sensor, and then other times when it's listed as an EPA sensor. Regardless of who put or installed the sensor or who's currently taking care of the sensor, whether it's an IDEM sensor or an EPA sensor, that data all gets posted on the same EPA website. So they have a repository and a database of their sensor readings going back many, many decades. And that's why it's probably a bit confusing when I say IDEM or EPA. Effectively, they're the same entity when it comes to the data that's collected.
But I'm only aware of two sensors. One
Two
that
sensors.
two EPA sensors in the Northwest Indiana that are near the BP.
Yeah, and so I'm sort of broadly talking about these sensors across. I mean, we're trying to look at data in LaPorte County, in Porter County, and in Lake County, because we all sort of share the same air mass. So I actually have a plot later on that shows all of the sensors, but if you go to that website, and I'll show you where that is later, you can actually click on the sensor and see who's nominally in charge of it and where it is also.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'll don't let me forget at the end. I'll crank that web page open and we can go take a look at that.
I was just
I'm
gonna
gonna
dump some links in the chat. This is Kathy Luther. I used to work at Item. Do you
Hi.
want me to do that, or do you want to wait till you do it?
That's totally fine.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I've got just a little picture of it, but if you've got the links already
Yeah,
up
I
for
can.
them to
I'll
go.
just stick them in the chat, but the picture you can actually explain, so that's better. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's perfect. Thank you so
Mm-hmm.
much. Okay. Oh, and I see in the chat, Mike is asking me where was the EPA monitor compared with the purple air sensor? And Mike, I can't exactly remember which one we chose for this, but I think we tried to pick one that was pretty close to the purple air sensor. And to be honest, I can't even remember which purple air sensor I chose for this. So apologies. Uh, it's somewhere in the region. I just grabbed a couple of them real quick. But part of the reason I'm not so concerned about that is that, and Mike might know this from some of my other presentations, but we see very similar data in Northwest Indiana because of how quickly things mix up with the high winds that we have and the weather that we have. And so we haven't really found a lot of a difference between air quality, say in Valparaiso versus Gary. They tend to see a lot of the same general behaviors of air quality, although we're still trying to kind of tease out exactly how much difference there is. And there's some statistics that I have to do and all kinds of stuff. But at least as far as what the purple air sensors are telling us, we see those pretty overlapped. So the big difference between these two methods is that the method that the EPA uses a technique where they're actually, much like I was with my little tape with the lines on it, they're depositing those particles on that tape. Whereas, the purple air sensors are using a different technique and they're actually measuring the light that's scattered by that particle kind of going through the instrument. And it turns out that when you collect particles versus when you just sort of look to sense them with scattered light, they don't always agree. And you have to kind of think about, well, which one is the method that we want to use? And the EPA, has policies that have been in place for air quality for a long time, and they have a specific method that they use for their air sensors, and it's a gravimetric method. So they get these particles and they deposit them not onto a piece of tape, onto a filter, and they actually weigh that filter. And then that filter tells them by mass how much air, was collected or how many particles were collected by mass. And then they sort of divide that by the amount of air that was flowing through the instrument. And I actually have done the same thing with my little ticker tape on a number of occasions before too. And it's a really pretty reliable technique. Sort of. And so that's what I'll get into next. So in the top left plot here is it was a wonderful paper by scientists, Dr. Barkjohn, works at the EPA. And what they did is they took just like hundreds of purple air sensors that were next to EPA sensors, and they plotted them on this graph. And that you see that they put that kind of black line between them. And so they're figuring out what the relationship between their EPA method, which is something that they have a protocol for and it's established, it's part of the policies that they've developed over the years. And, purple air or light scattering detectors, they're kind of the new kid on the block. So they've got to conform to the same type of measurement. And so they found a scaling factor that helped align these two things to each other. So that's great. Slight issue I might have with that technique is that when we're thinking about fitting this data, you'll notice that most of those data points fall in the green and yellow regions of air quality. Now, being that we're in Northwest Indiana and we know we have some pretty polluted air, we're probably a little bit more concerned with data points that are kind of above the yellow into the orange and the red zone. And you'll notice in that plot that there are very few data points that are sort of in the unhealthy region. And so I would say that there's still some question about whether or not that fitting procedure and that correlation between the two types of sensors is necessarily accurate when we're maybe not measuring the same type of air quality across the board. The other thing that I'll bring up is a study that I was a part of, sort of accidentally back when I was a professor in Alaska, and I was working with a graduate student at that time who had taken our samplers and they had actually collected volcanic ash. And so volcanoes were a big deal up in Alaska, and they created a lot of air particulates. And we actually put some of our sensors right next to the volcano to try and measure those particles. And the fascinating thing about that was that we had these very nice deposition parameters, and we had these very specific particle cutoff sizes and all this stuff, so that we were collecting this size particle on this piece of tape and this size particle on this piece of tape and this size particle on this piece of tape. The problem was that guy did too good of a job, and he actually went and took a scanning electron micrograph of the deposited particles that we collected on our tape. And so what you're kind of looking at over here, this black and white image, what we should see is that all the particles that are deposited there, all the little white flecks, are the same size, meaning that we've selected out a particular region or particular size of particle, and only that particle has been deposited onto this tape. And that's really important because the EPA is concerned about particles that are 2.5 micrometers or smaller. Okay, so 2.5 micrometers, if you look in the bottom right of that scanning electron micrograph, you'll see this little bar that says 100 micrometers. And so if you imagine something that's only 2.5 micrometers, right, probably the width of one of those lines is bigger than 2.5 micrometers. Okay, so we're looking at little dots on this black and white image that are barely visible and are very small. So does anyone see particles bigger than that? I see some. I see quite a few, actually. And that's the fascinating part about this, is that we thought we were being really careful about selecting out just 2.5 micron particles or smaller. And it turns out we collected a whole bunch of really big ones too. And here's the bad news. When we looked at our deposition tape that was supposed to be bigger than 2.5 microns, like 10 microns or larger, there was a whole bunch of little tiny particles on that tape that weren't supposed to be there. It was only supposed to be big ones. So we found out really quickly from this study, and I tried to get proposal funded to actually publish this data and go in and statistically analyze it with some particle counting tools and all kinds of stuff. What we thought about what particles we had and measuring them wasn't maybe doing a very good job at separating these things based on size. And that is interesting to me because when we think about these EPA sensors where they're doing the same thing and depositing these particles on a filter, what they do is they make sure that things bigger than 2.5 microns are thrown away before they land on the filter. Well, My hypothesis is possibly that a lot of particles that are smaller than 2.5 microns, as well as the ones that are bigger, are getting thrown out of that instrument and not actually getting measured, which might be why their numbers are so much lower than the purple air sensor numbers. So I'm working on that. I've got a lot of EPA data that I'm cranking through and trying to do some statistical analyses on, but I've got some really good scanning electron micrograph images that show that when you do these aerodynamic cutoff instruments where you try and separate the particle sizes, which the EPA does to make sure that they're just looking at the small ones so that they can have their attainment numbers and enforce their policy, there may be some issues with exactly the values that we're getting out of those instruments. Yes, Kathy. Oh, I
Yeah,
saw you had your hand
yeah, I
up.
did. No, I just had a question, and now of course my dog's gonna bark. About the clumping. Like, how
Yeah,
do the clumps count? Do they count like, does a clump count as 100 small particles or one big one?
that is a great question. So that's part of the problem I had when I was doing my particle counting measurements is
Hmm.
that they can't differentiate between, the
Yeah,
little pieces that are making up the big clump
yeah.
versus just the big clump itself, right?
Hmm.
So they'll try to outline this and they will just say that's one particle. But it's pretty obvious here from that zoomed in image that
Yeah.
we can see the morphology is it's a collection of a lot of little particles, right? Now, what's also really fascinating about this is I've got some SEM images that also show splats. And splats were something I identified as a particle or a group of particles that came in hydrated, right? And this is a problem for Northwest Indiana because our humidity is pretty high. And it got size selected based on this, but then it splatted and evaporated and then left behind a different size particle and a weird shape on the tape when we did the SEM image. So then we have to also think about how does that get counted? Does that get counted as the right size particle? Because it was bigger when it came in than when it splatted and evaporated. And because these all work on pumps, it presents a lot of issues when we're trying to count those particles. And certainly, the other thing that's hard to tell about this is I can see a particle size, but really we have to think about mass when we're depositing these things. And some particles will weigh more than others based on what they're made of. So it's a bit of a wishy-washy zone there in terms of counting them, but we're definitely seeing a lot of particles that are winding up in places. So even if this was an aggregate of these smaller particles, it should have been mass selected out of here at a different stage. So I can see that it's still made up of the same sort of stuff, but it shouldn't have landed here. It should have landed somewhere else. And that can happen still in a lot of other cases too. But yeah, fascinating question. And I don't have a good answer about how to do that. This is more like it's a qualitative look
Yeah.
at,
Hmm.
huh, that's not what I expected. And it might be why
Hmm.
the light scattering detectors measure things differently than the mass deposition sensors.
Right. And then it's interesting, and this isn't your, now I'm interested in the health data. When they did all the health studies, to what
Yeah,
detail did they analyze the particles for that? But
right.
that's just me
And
being
I've
a
also
dork.
thought about this like, okay, so if I have a big aggregate particle and that gets filtered out in my nose, that's probably better for me than if they were still all small particles. But then I've also learned about how when it gets filtered out in your nose or your esophagus, then it just goes right into your stomach. And that's actually a much better way to dissolve nasty things and get them into your body than through your lungs. Your lungs actually a pretty good barrier for the most part. So yeah, all very interesting stuff. So still working on that, but I think I'm on the trail of why I'm having this difficulty with disagreement between the two sensors. And maybe by next year, I'll have that figured out. Maybe. Um, I also wanted to highlight something I think is kind of cool, which is a fun little toy that I got into, and I, have been having fun with it. So I wanted to know if purple air sensors really cared about whether they were pointed sideways or upside down. So I did this study, and uh, I can't remember which of these is sideways and which is upside down, but essentially we're looking at, in the yellow orange, the blue blue, and the green green. We're looking at two sensors, one of which is pointed the right way, and the other one's sort of turned on its side or turned upside down. And you'll see that, there's a yellow and an orange like right on top of each other. And so those are the two different sensors. One of them's pointed the wrong way and one's the right way. They seem to measure those larger particles the same. And then in the blue, that's a smaller particle. Seems like those two are right on top of each other as well. And then the green is the smallest size particle. And so it seems to not, purple air doesn't really care which way it's pointed unless it's raining. And then it gets really mad because when it fills up with water upside down, it does not, it's not happy. And I have ruined a sensor that way, not unintentionally, it fell over. But what this told me is that, those fans are kind of pulling that air in regardless of which way it's pointed. And, the air comes in and goes out and it measures the particles about the same. And the reason I was interested in doing that is I wanted to put a sensor on a drone so that I could fly it around. But the problem is I can't put it pointed down because of the rotors messing up the air. So I had to kind of put it on top of the sensor pointed sideways. And we did some testing with that, even to we put the sensor on the drone and we taped it to a table so it couldn't take off. And we ran the drone for a while and measured two sensors and the data, right on top of each other, whether the drone was running or not. So I was really happy with that result. And we got to do a really fun test with this, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But we did a test run on dry ground to make sure that we didn't crash the darn thing. And so here's a little video of us flying up at the dunes, and you can see Arcelor off there in the distance, and the little camera on the drone pointing.
I
And
think your screen is flipped. Like, I don't know. I can only see you. Can you guys see the screen? It might be my
oh shoot,
computer.
it's not showing the
I'm not
presentation
seeing it.
anymore.
Is it just me?
I can see the video.
Okay, so it's just me. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I can
Sorry
see
to
the
interrupt.
I can see the video.
Sorry. Sorry, never mind. I'm a dork.
Darn it! It's a fun one, Kathy. Uh,
I'll figure it out. I'll figure it out.
but yeah, we took a little video of the drone, and then I'll see if I can go backwards and start it again. But we also had the sensor measuring particles as we flew up the air column. And then you probably saw in the video, we decided to take a trip down the beach away from the mill. And this was all just sort of a proof of concept to see if we could measure air particles while we were flying the drone. And our hope is that we're going to be able to actually get ourselves into some of the plumes from the industries to sort of measure what the concentrations are at the point source. Now, there's a slight problem with this, and that is, and at the time we didn't know this, but technically illegal to launch your drone from a national park. So don't tell anyone that I accidentally didn't know that. I was sort of pleased that the video, at least on Google Earth, shows me landing in the water. So technically, it's okay to take off from the water. But that got us thinking, hey, why don't we do that? And so Susan Duncan's wonderful husband, David, offered to take us out on the boat with our drone and actually see if we could get in one of the plumes of exhaust coming from one of the mills. So here we are. I put floaties on the feet in case we crashed. And then we had this kind of like big foam buoy that we tried to launch off of. And this is my student Abe, who is helping me out. Apparently, there were no life jackets big enough for me, so I'm squished into a little tiny one. But I'll just play the little video here of our takeoff. And so we've got it floating out there in the water. Oh, well, I don't know. I guess that wasn't the takeoff. Maybe maybe I'll show the landing here at least. Okay, well here it is coming in for a landing. And it's funny, I almost lost my finger on this one because it got a little too close to my hand. Anyway, so we managed not to lose it in the drink, but yeah, we were able to actually do a little flying around, and unfortunately the winds weren't in our favor that day. Um, but we're hopeful to be able to use this to do some studies, not just using the purple air sensor, but I've got a little tiny vacuum pump that I'm going to stick on this thing with a filter too. So that hopefully we can really try and examine some of the chemical composition of the plumes that are sort of spreading out over Northwest Indiana. And even, sometimes these plumes head up to Waukegan, they're up north of Chicago. So um, that should be kind of a nice little tool. And I thought it's just a fun little toy that you guys would be interested to see. But back to our original topic about moving forward and keeping positive. I wanted to tell you guys about some new technologies that I think are coming up that are really interesting. One of them is the Epic camera that's on a satellite that's been put out in space now. And this Epic camera can actually measure aerosols on the ground based on the wavelengths of light that it detects across the United States. And it's got the ability to kind of sweep across the whole US and capture that information, I think every few hours, perhaps, or something like that, at least during the daytime. It doesn't work at night because it uses the sunlight to kind of get that reflective wavelength back to the camera. And so, yeah, it makes these big, huge swaths and can go across. And of course, in their promo image, I'm so grateful that they took the time to focus in on Chicago. Thank you, NASA. I really appreciate that. And the big red spot that we have around the lake there from our apparently poor air quality. So that's a really nice tool. I'm hoping that since it's in space, they're not going to turn it off because it's kind of already up there, but that's the hope. So that's really cool. Pay attention to that. And then as far as we're concerned in our local area, right, we've got some challenges. There's things sort of not showing up on the EPA website anymore. And we know that they're sort of losing some of their staff that are part of some of the programs that we've come to count on, especially in our area. So it's time for us to really like get moving and step in and do what we can and be a positive contributor to helping people in our community, and that's what I hope we all do. And here are some of my heroes that are actually doing that. This is a group from Gary, the Guard group, that's doing some really good work, making sure that we don't have a whole bunch of trash burned in Gary, and they were able to keep the Fulcrum plant from being put in their area. That was amazing success. And then this is the Just Transition Northwest Indiana group that had huge success with the coal ash removal at the NIPSCO power plant there and getting that removed safely, with a lot of care taken for the citizens that might be impacted by that coal ash sort of blooming out when they removed it. Fantastic work by both of those groups. And I think we can continue to do awesome stuff like that today. And so just to pitch this to you guys as a resource, if you just go to Google and type in Iceman Valpo, my last name, and Valpo's my university, you'll see one of the top two links that pops up here is a place where I've gone ahead and put some of our data for you to look at. One of the things about the Purple Air website is that it kind of shows you current data, but it's hard to look back at really old data. So what I've done is taken the opportunity for all of our sensors that we've kind of had some pretty reliable measurements from and from those in other areas, and I've sort of pasted them here on my website. So we can go here and look at one of our Valpo sensors, and you get a little picture of kind of about where it's located. And you can click on any of those months and you can look at those data plots and sort of see what the air quality was for that particular day or month or week or whatever the case may be. Yes, Pat.
I have to remove my mute arrow first. Thank you.
It's okay.
I just hope to add another uh, uh, page on the website for Facebook. We have the BP and Whiting Watch, where we periodically post different images from the purple air to show what's happening at a certain point in time. And we also, like you've been doing, pull up the charts to show recent history, to show whether a recent peak at, shall we say, unique times. So just want to
Yeah.
also share that BP and Whiting Watch because it's a public Facebook page.
Awesome. So would you be able to maybe paste a link to that in the chat
Sure,
for us?
sure.
That would be awesome. Yeah, and thank you guys for doing that. That is absolutely what I would hope our citizens are using the purple layer sensors for. That's phenomenal. And there is also, speaking of that, and I think we mentioned this earlier, there's now fence line monitors at BP, and they do have a website for that as well, right? So,
Yes, it's a 2 week average, so it's saying much.
yeah, that can be not the best. But anyway, so that's available. And then, okay, so here is the website that I think Kathy probably posted for us, which is the sort of they call it a geographic information systems map, which shows all of the sensors that have ever existed and currently exist in Northwest Indiana and sort of the south part of Chicago. And you can see on the right that I've checked a bunch of boxes here for all the different kinds of sensors, not just particulate matter that I've been measuring with purple airs, but they also have ozone, they have lead, they have nitrous oxide. And so what my students and I are trying to do is get this data downloaded so we can also have that on my website for people to look at as well. So that can be a really handy tool if you want to go and look at what values the EPA gave for a particular time. You can click on the little map balloon and it'll bring up a little pop-up window and you can look at archive data there as well. I'm just trying to suck all of that data down as soon as possible before this website disappears. So that's what I've got my students working on every week right now. Um, anyway, so I hope that is a couple of interesting and cool things that are going on that we're trying to do, trying to step in to fill the gap for our citizens and do good work. I'd like to thank the National Institute of Health, especially their Environmental Health Science Division for funding that's allowed us to purchase some of these purple air sensors, and the Indiana Space Grant Consortium also allowed us to purchase some of the sensors. And then, of course, my university, Valparaiso University, thanks for giving me a job. And then I cannot thank enough all of my colleagues with our little group of, academics and lawyers and citizens and our community action group. And we have this North Lake County Environmental Partnership that we kind of formed of folks that were concerned about lots of stuff, including air quality in Northwest Indiana. So anyhow, that's about all I have. So
Can I ask a question, please?
You sure can.
Good. I'm Mike's wife, and I have a question about the sensor on top of Washington High School on 114th Avenue, all in Chicago. I remember it from over 50 years ago when I was a student there, and Republic Steel was across the street, so it was a big deal in the neighborhood at the time. I haven't heard much about it lately, so I didn't even know if it was still there. So I Googled it, and I found a US EPA report from October 2021. So at least as of 3.5 years ago, it was active. Do you know if it still is active and being monitored?
So if that map shows it and the last data was from 2021, it's probably been deactivated since then. Um, but it could have been operating up until that point. So let me see. I'm gonna just real quick try and grab that map for us. Uh, and oh, no, that's not it. Well, while I'm looking, were there any other questions?
Um, I don't really have a question, but I guess I wanted to share that we use some of our um, air quality public education money to fund some purple air monitors for the Dunes Learning Center, and they were they're not showing up yet on the Purple Air website. So, but I know they were going to spend some time. They do some kind of middle school age STEM enrichment at a bunch of the Boys and Girls Clubs and YMCA's in North Lake County and in Michigan City. And so
Uh-huh.
they were gonna develop some kind of curriculum for the or project type, um, because I'm not a teacher, for those students, to maybe put them up at their schools or their Boys and Girls Clubs and do science projects with the whole data set. So it looks like they're
Yeah.
not online yet, but I need to talk to Aaron and see when they might have some stuff and they could give us a presentation or put something out about that project. But I'm really excited about it to get kids involved, right? Kids really like hands-on
It's
stuff, plants and bugs and so, but maybe they'll be interested in the air too.
yeah, and in fact, like one of my I don't know, like all of these people that try to get you to think about doing great things. So like you got to make a plan, you got to have a goal, right, of this thing you want to accomplish. And my like harebrained idea in my head was to actually have an Indiana network of like all the middle schools or high schools or something where they each had a purple air sensor. They were able to take a water sample and they were able to take a soil sample from their community. And we have the tools now to analyze those really quickly, actually, for heavy metals, certainly measure air quality. And I was like, what better way to do that? Because, the kids, right, they're like super vulnerable. And if they all had an air sensor on top of their school, and, if they were involved in science projects where they were working with a college professor to like measure their water quality and measure their soil quality or be interfacing with their community with people that had concerns and questions. And so in my brain, that was the vision. And so exactly what you're talking about. It warms my heart to hear that because that's like such a cool thing. I love it. Oh, I think you're muted, Kathy. Sorry.
That's okay. And we're talking about Partners for Cleaner. We're talking about figuring out ways to get more of those out to
Yeah,
organizations and
awesome.
people. So hopefully there'll be more.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that.
When I was in high school, our social studies teacher, Ken O'Neill, made us aware of the sensor on top of our high school. And I remember he took us on a field trip to a meeting to protest. So we had our signs and costumes and everything. And it was
Oh,
a beautiful experience, but I have to say it's a little depressing that more than 50 years later, we're still in the same fight.
yeah, it is. I think about that too. Or that we've gone backwards a little bit. I don't know. that's why I love this idea of getting the schools involved, because I think, getting those kids to recognize the importance of this stuff, it affects them. It's going to affect them for the rest of their lives. And it's such a great rallying point too, because this is like air quality is our whole planet. When dust blows from the Sahara, it winds up, in South America. When dust blows from China, it winds up in the United States. And we know we can see these elemental signatures. And you got to understand that if dust is making it that far, then everything else is too. And I just think it'd be such a great way, just like the ozone hole, right? For us to all say, hey, this is bad for everybody. Let's all work together to make this better and more sustainable for our future. So yeah, I'm gonna maintain hope. I'll try. I'm not like that every day, but
Any more questions? Hearing none, I just want to state that we are grateful to Dr. Iceman for his presentation this evening. And Valerie and I thank all of you for attending, and we'll see you on May 6th. Okay?
all right. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great
And
evening.
thank you. Bye.
Have
Bye
a
now.
good evening. Later.